breathing in and letting go. Adjust the mic a little bit more. Excellent. Thank you for all the YouTubers joining us in. Let's take another breath. Coming into this delicious moment. Deep breath. Here we are. So some of you may have seen, because I posted today's topic in advance on social media, but I really wanted to go into talking about the gentle strength versions of power, because so often we hear about power in a very aggressive, forceful approach. And we even hear that in the words such as power trips or power struggles. And so power is often used as a form of force. But there's a lot of gentle powers out there that are actually more healing, that are actually more effective. And those are what we're going to talk about today and learn how to cultivate in our lives. And I have to say, I got inspiration from this talk called The Three Powers, from a video called The Three Powers by one of Thich Nhat Hanh's students, Sister Nghiem, and she gave a talk at one, I think it might have been one of the monasteries here in the United States from Thich Nhat Hanh's Plum Village tradition. But it was just a really beautiful talk, and so that's what gave me the inspiration to go into it today. Of course, I put my own twist on the three teachings to make it, I mean, it was already aligned with living peace, but all teachers have their style, myself included. So let's go ahead and breathe that in. Just wanted to honor that real quick. Thank you. So something that was shared that I kind of expanded upon was the virtues we practice in our daily life become power. They become energy and a source of quiet strength. And so I don't know if a lot of us really think about the word virtue on a daily basis. Sometimes people might think of the word virtue, but they apply it to a concept of morality, to where it turns more into this concept of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. And unfortunately, when we go down that rabbit hole, it turns into more judgment and then more suffering, because when we're in judgment towards people, it often causes us to do things that are a bit harmful or say things that are a bit harmful. But when we're in acceptance of things and we let go of justifying the rightness or the wrongness of our behavior, someone else's behavior, and we just choose to love them unconditionally anyway. Doesn't mean you have to sit down and have tea with them every day, but we choose to carry that spirit of compassion. It really does, it creates a form of quiet strength within us. Has anyone ever had a judgment before? It almost siphons your power. Think about it. Think of how draining judgments are. But then think about the times that you've chosen to forgive, or the times that you've accepted something and you've just returned to yourself. It actually cultivates energy. It cultivates a quiet strength. And so you're going to notice that the three powers we talk about today cultivates that strength within ourselves. And the first power, and those of you who have this, you're welcome to follow along. The first power is the power of understanding. And you're going to notice that through all three powers, I also talk about the power of stopping, and I'm going to go into that in a little bit. But the first power is the power of understanding, and I'll go ahead and read the paragraph. When our ego is triggered, it doesn't want to understand. It wants to project its opinion onto others and bend the world to its reality. When we override our ego and do not act from it, we learn to stop. We learn to consciously breathe. We begin to open ourselves up to gentle curiosity. We gain the ability to listen without feeling threatened. Being able to stop is a great power. Being able to stop is a great power. And today I wanted to share a few stories from my past, just moments where like these awarenesses came into my being. And this one actually took me back to my childhood, the playground of the childhood. And I would say probably like kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and third grade are actually, I have very clear memories of that time, because it was a bit before when all the technology and the video games hardcore hit and started distracting my generation. And so I remember always just playing outside as a kid, and especially on the playground, I'd always be under giant cottonwood trees, like giant cottonwood trees or giant maple trees. And I would just like sit and observe I was that kid. Most of the time, I would sit and observe. And this was also before the time where things started shifting and I went into a deeper depression. Because at that time, it was still kind of neutral. But I remember it was first grade, and I had a couple close friends, and there was this girl that was kind of a bully at school. And for whatever reason, I have this image imprinted in my mind that I haven't thought about in years, but it's there. We were on, those monkey bars that you're climbing around, and this girl who's normally a bully was just so soft that day. And she came over to me and my friends, and she's just like, I don't have anyone to play with. Everyone doesn't like me. And we, of course, just opened ourselves up to her. And, she gave us a soft smile. And I felt like that was near the end of the year because I don't have any memories after that. It was like one of those last days of a semester. And then unfortunately, those two friends I had other than her left to a different school. And then she also left to a different school. So after that moment, it was just like, that was it. And so it was just so strange, though, in that moment, even being a first grader, that there was this beautiful opening of this girl who was not experiencing kindness in her life. And so she was often causing pain for other people. But for whatever reason, she opened up in that moment, and then we were receptive enough to welcome her. And that just always really stuck with me. But then later, 5 years later or whatnot, when I was in sixth grade, I would say was the climax of the torment that I was receiving at school, that I actually had to switch schools because of the stuff that was going on. And I wish I remembered this at this time, but again, you're a sixth grader. You don't have the greatest self-awareness in the world. But there was a girl, now that I look back, that was very similar in nature to her, who was like my greatest tormentor, and even stood up in front of the whole class and just lashed into me in front of everyone. And the teacher did nothing. And as an adult, there's been so many times where I've gone back and reflected on conversations, interactions that I had with this girl. And in this moment, looking back, she carries the same essence of that first grader. And although I never had any anger towards her as a sixth grader, I was just internalizing it all. There's still a part of me that looks back and can't help but have love and compassion for that girl's pain. And now as an adult, I found out how her life went about and why she was behaving the way she was behaving. But this is the power of understanding that as a child, as a teen, and then especially as an adult, anytime I look back to times of abuse in my life, times of torment, it's never from a place of anger. It's never from a place of frustration or grief. It's interesting is it always comes from a place of going back and finding the understanding involved. And that is such a great power that we can cultivate within ourselves, because not only does understanding create the ability to love, it creates the ability to have compassion, it creates the ability to accept, it creates the ability to build bridges. How many of us, when we have been wronged before, we justify our anger towards the situation or the person instead? We're pretty much just like, well, fuck them. They screwed us, they hurt us, and that's that. And for whatever reason, as a child, as a teen, as an adult, that just never was my MO. And here we are teaching it. So it makes sense. Became the life's work. But I just love situations like that, to where we're able to just transport ourselves back. And I'm going to get into this later on, how I get into those transporting moments. But really think about that, how our ego, when the ego is triggered, it doesn't want to understand. Really hear that. When your ego is triggered, the last freaking thing it wants to do is understand. And so what a gift it is for us to sit down in future moments, in meditation, in contemplation, and then take ourselves back into difficult moments that we may have gone through, and to really breathe into it and choose to look at all angles. Maybe it comes easy to you, maybe it comes very difficult for you, but nonetheless, if you find yourself going back to those moments, and I have to say there definitely was post-traumatic stress that I developed as a kid that went through so much shit at school, because for so many, like I would say the first few years of my 20s, every single week I'd have thoughts that would bring me back into those moments. And sometimes they were painful, sometimes they were sources of compassion, but it was so fascinating that they were haunting me. And that's how you know that there is some weird karmic thing that was created in that time. But then you can turn it into a source of strength, turn it into a source of understanding that actually allows you to love so much more deeply. And that's the second power, the power of love, which maybe here at the Zen Cowboy, you would hear the power of peace, because we look at love as the outer expression of inner peace, that until we can cultivate more inner peace, the more inner peace we have, the easier it is to love. Nonetheless, let's go ahead and read it real quick. The power of love exists within our ability to touch inner peace. When there is a separation between our mind and body, when we feel all twisted up, it becomes very hard to give or to show love. This is why loving others is an inward journey of self, a journey of unwinding our heart and mind so that we can begin to think clearly without feeling threatened, without feeling the need to constantly fight or defend. Again, being able to stop is a great power. Really hear that. Whoever felt twisted up in your mind and body? Hard to love, isn't it, when you feel that way? And so another thing you can write down for those of you who are taking notes, and you've heard me say this before most likely, but love is presence. Love is the ability and the energy and the embodiment of giving presence. And that's what I loved about my child self between first grade and third grade, is because of just the nature of my life at that time and being so connected to Mother Earth, I was very present with all that was in front of me. And a lot of times, especially back in the day, you'll notice that children themselves are often very present creatures, sometimes so much so that it's like that's the only thing that exists in their life right there in those moments. And then they go on to the next moment, and then they go on to the next moment. Even if the past moment was really painful, they're already on to the next moment. As adults, we're really the ones that cultivate those hardcore patterns of constantly reflecting back, constantly reflecting back, constantly reflecting back. While when we're in that growth period, we just move on, move on, move on. We're very adaptive creatures. But anyway, love is presence. And so for whatever reason, my mind still to this day goes back to those beautiful moments under those trees and just observing life happening around me, observing the playground happening around me. I was rarely involved in the happenings, but I was the observer outside of it, which then allowed me to become a more effective adult as being the observer of my mind, being the observer of my thoughts happening, being the observer of my feelings happening, rather than mistakenly thinking that I am my thoughts or I am my feelings. Let's take a breath. So love is presence. And a story that helped me manifest this more than anything, which is really painful, I'm okay with it today. But I raised animals. I raised chickens, ducks, geese, turkeys, and goats. That was my forte. I was the poultry wrangler, plus goats. And there was this time period where I had this other small chicken coop where I was raising baby chicks in another location. And it was under my tree fort. And it was just, I don't know, for whatever reason, that was a time in my life where I was struggling with presence. And I would get triggered by my animals because there was just so much demanding around it. It was probably the height of my depression as well. Anyone ever be in a rough mood and then your animals bother you instead of bringing you that joy? Sometimes that happens. And unfortunately, that day, I was just in a rush trying to feed them and take care of them. And I thought they were in front of me, but then I stepped behind myself and I stepped on one of the baby chicks. And its stomach was now on its outside, and it was still alive, and it was peeping, and just in so much pain. And then, of course, I go inside, and then I get my parents. My dad buries it while I watch as it's peeping into the earth, being covered up by the dirt. And so as a child, that's a pretty traumatic experience. And the guilt that I felt from that, moving forward into my life, I had to constantly revisit that memory and forgive myself. Because like in my mind, here I'm like this innocent child that's no longer innocent because I literally killed innocence. For me, baby chicks were the epitome of innocence. And so that taught me, it's like, holy shit, presence is important, because if you're in a rush to do something, you can literally take someone's life. You could take something's life. And so it taught me the importance of slowing down, being more mindful, watching if I'm frustrated, not doing things too hastily, because our words, our actions, quote, our missteps can cause great harm to the planet. And so there I was, 8, 9, 10, 11, I don't know, but boom, that hit me. And although it's a very painful memory, it's a very painful experience I went through, and of course painful for the baby chick that I just adored and loved, more or less, it was a fantastic learning opportunity for myself. And so it's so funny now, thinking in this era that we live in, where even as adults, sometimes we have this concept of like the smother mother, or the helicopter parents, where we're so protective of our children experiencing life and death, experiencing the painfulness of those experiences. But in actuality, at 8, 9, 10, 11, that was a beautiful thing for me to experience, because it taught me how actions have consequences and how it can really cause great harm. And so in that moment, I thought I was loving of my animals because I was taking care of them and yada, 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 all the ins and outs. I had great affection for them. But in that moment, I didn't have presence. So was it really love? Because my actions then led to great harm. So take that as a lesson in all of our own lives, to where we think that we love someone or we love something, but if we're not in presence with it, how often do our actions and words lead to great harm towards people and things? It's fascinating, isn't it? We say that we love, but when we're not present, our actions and our words cause great, 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 great harm, and sometimes violence, as the situation, really shows. So let's breathe that in. Didn't mean to bring down the house, but it's important nonetheless to really look at. And in Buddhism, in living peace in Dunisha, we don't shy away from looking at the ways that we have caused harm. We don't shy away of looking at the things that are uncomfortable or the things that cause violence. It's really important for us to lean into it, which beautifully goes into the third power, which is the power of cutting off affliction. The power of cutting off affliction. Affliction means the ways we cause suffering within ourselves and the way we spark suffering in others. Looking at how we think, speak, and act all show us very clearly how we promote suffering. However, it is difficult to see our reflection in running water. When our mind is scattered and overstimulated, we may not see the repercussions of our words and actions. This is why we sit, why we breathe, why we slow down. Being able to stop is a great power. So for me, when I first started learning a lot of these teachings, I would say mid-teen years, people always ask me, Lark, this shit seems so hard. How do we do it? How do you meditate? How can I find peace, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm always trying to think of new ways and creative ways to teach it. But really what worked for me was, and it's painful, but what worked for me is anytime I'd feel crazy, I would literally just sit and be with that crazy. And sometimes it would take 10 minutes, sometimes it would take 30 minutes, sometimes it would take an hour or 2 hours, but I would sit with myself until there was a moment of relief. And I would just constantly keep returning to my breath. And so as a teenager and I was learning meditation, it was often up here on our vacations to Colorado. I would literally just lay on the bed at night. It was like 11, midnight, 1 a.m. And I'm just like laying there hyperventilating from breathing. I'm just like thinking of the baby chick or thinking of other ways that I have harmed other people. It was very rarely about the harm that has been caused on me. It was often about the ways that I was really thinking clearly on how I've hurt other people in my life and working on forgiving myself so that I could have inner peace. It was the ways that I felt great shame or great embarrassment or great guilt. And so I would just constantly just sit with myself and breathe, sit with myself and breathe, perpetually returning to the breath. And what's funny is years later, now that I fully teach this stuff, it's my main thing. All of the Buddhist texts, it's always bringing you back to your breath, always bringing you back to your breath, leaning into the discomfort, leaning into the pain, leaning into the ways and recognizing the ways that our actions and our words cause the world harm, cause other people harm. And so there I was, that teenager, not fully understanding it, but there was something internal that I just knew I had to really give myself into this experience rather than perpetually shying away from it. Because again, our culture is a culture of distraction. And we have created a reality to where we could literally be distracted 24/7 now. Decades ago, you couldn't. You're kind of stuck with your thoughts and waiting and having to interact with people. But now we can literally be within our homes, order especially if you're in a city, order everything, never have to see a human. And at the same time, you could be fully plugged into social media. So at the same time, you never have to see humans anymore, but you're also possibly surrounded by them even more, but in halfway, because of the ability to have social media and to be on online forums and to interact, watch YouTube videos, all of these type of things. And so we're at a very interesting time to where late at night, back in the day, there was only a few TV channels, and before that, there was not even any TV channels. And so you were kind of stuck with your thoughts. Here, has anyone haven't been able to sleep and then you kind of just turn something on to take your mind off of it? It's quite common. Or you take some substance. And so what's beautiful as a teenager, I didn't really have that opportunity. I wasn't allowed to just go play more video games or watch TV, and that was before the smartphone. I didn't have a smartphone. So my options were sit there and suffer or read a book. And for me, the reading of the books generally was self-help books. I was really good into philosophy and self-help, but more often than not, I would sit with myself and just breathe through it. And so what a gift that is that the longer we distract ourselves from our pain and from these thoughts that keep arising, the longer they're going to persist throughout our life. So the more we distract ourselves, the more they persist. But when we actually take the time, maybe you don't want to do it every night because you'd be like, Alaric, I'll get no sleep. I have to work in the morning. Maybe you give yourself permission one night a week where you don't have to wake up super early and just be with yourself that night, fully leaning into everything, not using the crutch that you normally have, and allow all of it to surface. Because why does it keep surfacing randomly throughout the day, randomly throughout the night, having insomnia? It's because there's probably stuff that we haven't fully dealt with yet. And it's the subconscious mind and its love for us trying to be like, hey, you got some unresolved shit. Please listen. And rather than viewing it as something negative, we can view this pain as something beautiful that is going to teach us something. One of my favorite quotes is never to let our pain go to waste. There's always something delicious there in it that it has to teach us. So let's breathe that in. So again, because I was able to sit with myself, eventually it allowed for the cultivation of awareness, self-awareness. And that's when these memories really started going back into the past and back into the moments where I felt shame, embarrassment, grief, whatever. And then such as the first story I shared with the compassion for the tormentors, I was able to then flip the script, if you will, and cultivate that understanding, cultivate that compassion. But guess what? Understanding is really difficult to cultivate when your water is constantly rushing, when the waters of your mind is a raging river rather than a calm stream or eventually a very calm, docile pond. And that's why the power of stopping, the power of calmness, the power of understanding, the power of love, the power of cutting off afflictions is a gentle strength. When all of us go about trying to force things to happen, force relationships, accidentally or consciously manipulating people, Projecting anger, projecting grief, that's not understanding. That is, I'm right in my reality, or I'm uncomfortable in my reality, and you just need to stop. Rather than, it would be beneficial for me to stop. Take a step back, return to my inner sanctum, return to my heart, take refuge in my breath. Breathing in, I breathe in peace. Exhaling, I exhale love. Breathing in, I'm strong as a mountain. Breathing out, I'm clear as a sky. And so we breathe in, we exhale. And that is the greatest gift that we have, because you have this perpetual mindfulness tool that can constantly bring you back to the moment. And if you have a bell or a singing bowl, you can, breathing in, I know that I'm breathing in, exhaling. I know that I'm breathing out. Breathing in, I exhale peace. Breathing out, I exhale love. And so I wish I could wave this magic wand and say, it'll be easy. But really, honestly, it's constantly doing what I just shared with you, returning to the moment, and it's going to be possibly one of the most difficult things you'll ever do in your life if you do it perpetually for 30 or 60 days. Every day it gets a little bit easier, but what you're doing is something magnificent, because when you learn to bring your attention back into the moment, when you learn to stop, you're literally creating new neural pathways in your mind. You're creating a new default setting on how to respond to the triggers of life. Really hear that. You're creating a new default setting, because most of us have default settings that are very aggressive, that are very frustrating, that are very impatient, and then we react. But when you constantly, every time you're triggered, and you practice stopping, you're now developing a new pathway for your mind to go down. Rather than instantly going right, it starts going left, or rather than instantly going left, it starts to go right, and it takes time. But enough practice, if you practice every day for 60 days, or if you practice every day for 365 days, you'll notice it does become your new norm. And it's quite a beautiful thing, and it's not this constant uphill battle. It's quite fascinating. Let's breathe that in. So one question I'll leave you with, for those of you taking notes, you might want to write this down. When I say or do something, what is my real intention? When I say or do something, what is my real intention? When I say or do something, what is my real intention? That could become a beautiful new mantra, koan, affirmation, question for you to ask on a daily basis. Maybe you'll write it on a sticky note and have it on a few places so that you can really look at it and be reminded that throughout the day, when you're acting, when you're doing something, when you're frustrated, you can reflect and really get to the heart of it. Quite revealing. So let's breathe that in. So to recap, we have the power of understanding, the power of love, and the power of cutting off afflictions. And all three of them encapture the power of stopping. Don't speed up when you're frustrated. Don't try to do more when you're frustrated. Try doing less. Try speaking less. Try defending less. Try trying to control less. Try sitting with yourself and see if you're going to notice that maybe there will be a bit of a revelation there. Maybe there will be somewhat of an insight when we take that break. Beautiful stuff, powerful stuff. And again, what a great gift power can be for cultivating transformation and allowing this gentle strength within us to become our new source of power. We breathe in, we let go. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And as always, thank you, YouTubers, for following in. We appreciate all the donations, any donations that you're able to provide. And as always, there are links down below for our services if you're ever interested in working one-on-one, or if you appreciate these videos and would like to give a small donation monthly, you can set up something through PayPal or Patreon. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.